After Tyrrell brought out the six-wheeled P34 in 1976, other teams started to look into the idea of having more than four wheels on their cars. 3 F1 teams developed a six-wheeled car after Tyrrell, but each one was completely different in its design philosophy. The first car that we will be driving up the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb today is the March 240, which was built late in 1976 and tested in 1977. This car decided to put four wheels at the back rather than at the front like the P34. The lead designer at March, Robin Herd, decided that the aerodynamic gains by using four small wheels at the front were negated by the massive 24-inch rear wheels used on F1 cars at the time, which still produced around 30 to 40% of the car's overall drag. His design had four driven wheels at the back, but unlike the P34, all of the wheels were the same size of 16 inches in diameter. His reasoning was that smaller wheels all round would make the car slimmer, further improving aerodynamic performance, and that the four driven wheels at the rear would improve traction. Sadly, due to financial problems at the March F1 team, rather than the car being developed from scratch, a March 761 from the 1976 season was adapted and existing parts lying around the factory were used where possible. One of the compromises was the gearbox. The original gearbox designed had ribs going across it to provide the strength of running a second axle. However, due to some of the costs of the ribs, they were removed. This proved costly at the car's first test at Silverstone late in 1976, where the casing flexed and the gears unmeshed, essentially making the car two-wheel drive again. The gearbox problem was fixed by February of 1977, and Ian Scheckter, Jodie's brother, test drove it in its four-wheel drive configuration and lauded its grip and traction. Despite this, the car was never to see a Grand Prix, as March decided to reuse the 761 from the previous year instead. In 1979, however, a British hill climber by the name of Roy Lane bought a March 771 chassis and got the permission of Robin Herd to use the gearbox from the 240. Lane fit the unit into his 771 chassis and made his own six-wheeled March. He won a few British hill climb events in the car that year, but ultimately decided to switch back to a four-wheel configuration after having some problems. Let's see how quickly this relatively untested car can get up the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb. The 1977 March 240 did the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb in 46.02 seconds. That time puts it 32nd on our leaderboard, right between the Ferrari LaFerrari and Porsche 918. It's about half a second slower than the other F1 cars from a similar period, but I'm not sure how good the mod handles the physics of having multiple wheels, etc. In 2015, the real 240 went up the hill at Goodwood and posted a time of 47.05 seconds, a second slower than our time. I think that this is about right, as the game is generally quicker than real life and you don't have to worry about destroying the only one of these cars in the world. The next car to be driven up the hill in this six-wheeled F1 car special is the 1977 Ferrari 312 T6. Just like Robin Herd at March, Ferrari designer Mauro Forghieri saw the Tyrrell P34 and concluded that the rear wheels were negating any gain in aerodynamic performance through the smaller front wheels. His solution was to put two front wheels side by side on the rear axle, just like a heavy-duty lorry. The front wheels are much smaller than the rear wheels, and so there would be a much lower drag coefficient. Forghieri also summarised that by having two smaller contact patches on each side of the car would mean that when traditional cars would start to slide, the 312 T6 would still have plenty of grip. The car was built and handed over to Niki Lauda and Carlos Reutemann to test. The car didn't test well, but even if it had, the regulations in F1 at the time meant that there was a maximum width of the car which the 312 T6 exceeded by quite some way. The car was never to see a Grand Prix, so let's see how quickly it can go up the Duke of Richmond's driveway. The 1977 Ferrari 312 T6 did the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb in 44.56 seconds. That time puts it 24th on our leaderboard, 0.2 of a second ahead of the Porsche 962C and 1/10 of a second behind the McLaren P1. It also means that it is just over a second quicker than the Tyrrell P34. Obviously, it is almost impossible to give these experimental cars accurate physics because they are so untested and are rarely seen, let alone driven today. It was a fun car to drive, and you could definitely feel the extra grip on the rear, giving me the confidence to push it a bit more than the Tyrrell or the March. The final car in this special episode is one that I have seen many times at Goodwood in real life, often forming part of the Williams Heritage Collection runs. It is, of course, the Williams FW08B from 1982. In 1981, Williams was still using the famous Cosworth DFV engine, whereas teams like Ferrari and Renault were introducing their turbo engines, which were around 180 horsepower more powerful than the DFV. It became clear that Williams needed to try something radical to compete against them. Just like the engineers at March and Ferrari in the 1970s, Frank Durney, a consultant at Williams, realised that the rear tyres produced a lot of drag. Frank Durney ran the maths and concluded that by using 4 front wheels at the back in a similar layout to the March 240, they would recoup the equivalent of 160 horsepower in gained aerodynamic performance. Patrick Head began working on the gearbox and rear suspension whilst Durney worked on the aerodynamics. Durney's aerodynamics drew heavily from the ground effect technology brought into F1 by Colin Chapman at Lotus. The original design didn't even have a rear wing. The Venturi tunnels that ran the length of the car produced enough downforce on their own. A test car was built dubbed the FW07D, based entirely on the FW07C used in the 1981 season, and Alan Jones flew back from the final race in Las Vegas to shake down the 6-wheeled car. After the initial test, another car was built, this time with the intention of it being used in the 1982 season. It was heavily tested by all of the Williams drivers, Alan Jones, Keke Rosberg, Jonathan Palmer and Jacques Lafitte. The FIA got wind of the project and immediately banned cars of more than 4 wheels. Patrick Head was apparently furious, and the car was never to see a Grand Prix. Let's see how quick this car really would have been by driving up the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb. The 1982 Williams FW08B did the Goodwood Festival of Speed hill climb in 42.94 seconds. That incredible time puts it 20th on our leaderboard, just 0.5 seconds behind the Bentley Speed 8 and 3/10 ahead of the Lola Aston Martin Le Mans car. I find that time truly incredible. It is only 1.5 seconds behind the Lotus 98T, which is in 18th place. I can't quite get over the fact that a naturally aspirated engine with just over 400 horsepower can come within 1.5 seconds of a 1200 brake horsepower turbo monster that also has the advantage of being 4 years newer. I hope you have enjoyed this special episode, and I will see you next time where we have another special episode for you. See you then.